The Enigma of the Forgotten. The Enigma of the Forgotten Attic. It was in the autumn of 1892, during one of those thick, yellowish fogs that descend upon London like a living thing, that the adventure which I have entitled The Enigma of the Forgotten Attic had its beginning. I had been out since early morning attending to several patients in the less salubrious quarters near the river, and it was past 6 o'clock when I at last mounted the 17 steps to our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street. The door of the sitting-room stood ajar, and as I entered I perceived my friend Sherlock Holmes seated in his armchair, his violin tucked beneath his chin, drawing from its strings a low, mournful melody that seemed to blend with the muffled sounds of the street below. The room was dimly lit by a single gas lamp turned low, and the fire in the grate had burned down to a sullen glow. Holmes's eyes were half closed, his thin, eager face outlined sharply against the darkness as the bow moved with slow precision. "Ah, Watson," he murmured without turning, "you are later than I expected. The fog has delayed you, no doubt, and you bring with you the faint odour of iodoform and the stronger one of the Thames at low tide." I laughed as I divested myself of my damp overcoat. "You are incorrigible, Holmes. Yes, a confinement case at Wapping. Successful, I am glad to say. But pray do not cease your playing on my account. That air is most soothing after a day such as this." He laid the violin gently in its case and rose, stretching his long limbs. "I have finished for the moment. The piece was merely an exercise in sustaining a minor key, much like the weather outside. But come, warm yourself by the fire. Mrs. Hudson has kept a dish of curry hot, and there is something else which may interest you far more than mutton." As I drew nearer the hearth, I observed upon the table, beneath the steady flame of the gas lamp which Holmes had now turned higher, a singular assortment of objects laid out upon a sheet of brown wrapping paper. They appeared to have been hastily yet deliberately arranged, and at first glance presented the aspect of a random collection of forgotten curiosities. There was a tarnished silver pocket watch, its case dented and its chain broken, the hands arrested at 17 minutes past 3. Beside it stood a small glass vial, corked and containing a clear, colourless liquid, upon whose faded label I could just decipher the words "Elixir Vitae" in an old-fashioned script. A map of London, much creased and worn, lay partly unfolded, with a circle drawn in red ink around the district of Whitechapel. A single black kid glove, stained darkly at the fingertips, as though with ink or soot, reposed next it, its fellow missing. A yellowed envelope sealed with a blob of red wax bearing the impression of a coiled serpent had been placed carefully in the centre. Scattered about were several playing cards, the ace of spades uppermost and staring boldly, while others lay half concealed beneath the map or the envelope. Finally, in one corner, almost as though it had been flung there in haste, was an old photographic portrait of a stern gentleman with a heavy moustache, the card slightly torn at one edge. I regarded this odd assemblage with puzzled amusement. "Holmes," said I, "what in the world is this? Some street vendor's bargain lot, or the contents of a dustbin?" My friend's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which I had learned to associate with the scent of a problem. "Neither, Watson. These articles arrived not an hour ago, delivered by a ragged urchin who vanished into the fog before Mrs. Hudson could question him. There was no note, no message, only this parcel, addressed to me in rough block letters." He lifted the pocket watch delicately between finger and thumb, turning it so that the lamplight caught the engraved initials upon the back. "At first sight, as you say, a mere jumble of trifles. Yet observe how carefully they have been chosen, how precisely arranged. Nothing here is truly random, Watson. This is a message A summons, I believe, from someone who stands in mortal peril and who has chosen this curious method to cry for help. I seated myself opposite him and stared again at the objects, striving to see in them what his keener vision had already perceived. But to me they remained an enigma, a broken watch, a vial of dubious elixir, a marked map, a solitary glove, a sealed envelope, scattered cards with the ominous ace of spades, and a torn photograph of an unknown gentleman. What possible connection could bind such disparate things? Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed upon the little collection, as though he could force it to yield its secret by sheer intensity of will. "Tomorrow," he said at length, "we shall learn more. Tonight, these silent witnesses must speak to me alone. But mark my words, Watson, this is no idle prank. Somewhere in London a drama is playing out, and these humble objects are the first faint clues to its unravelling." Outside, the fog pressed thicker against the window panes, and the distant clang of a bell echoed mournfully through the muffled streets. Within, the gas lamp flickered upon the table, casting long, wavering shadows over the mysterious assemblage that lay there, waiting, as it seemed, for the master mind that would one day compel it to reveal the full tale of treachery and death that lay hidden within its mute appeal. The melancholy strains of Holmes's violin had scarcely faded into silence when we heard the sharp peal of the doorbell below. Mrs. Hudson's measured tread ascended the stairs, and a moment later she appeared at the door, bearing a card upon her tray. "A young lady to see Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she announced. "Miss Eleanor Hargrove. She seems most distressed, sir, and would not give her business to me." Holmes's eyes brightened with that sudden alertness I knew so well. "Show her up at once, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, we are about to receive the author, or at least the bearer, of our little charade upon the table." In a few moments our visitor entered, and I rose to offer her a chair by the fire. She was a woman of perhaps 25, tall and gracefully formed, with features that would have been strikingly handsome, but for the pallor of grief and anxiety that overlaid them. Her dress was of deep mourning, fashioned with quiet elegance, and her gloved hands trembled slightly as she seated herself. "Mr. Holmes," she began in a low, earnest voice, "I have come to throw myself upon your mercy and skill. I am Eleanor Hargrove, only daughter of the late Sir Reginald Hargrove, whose death 3 weeks ago was reported in the papers as having arisen from natural causes. I will not accept that verdict. I believe my father was murdered." Holmes leaned forward, his thin, hawk-like face intent. "Pray compose yourself, Miss Hargrove, and tell us the circumstances from the beginning. Omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." She drew a deep breath and steadied herself. "My father was a wealthy importer of Eastern goods, spices, silks, curiosities, and in robust health until the very evening of his death. On that night he entertained 3 gentlemen at our house in Grosvenor Square. His business partner, Mr. Victor Slade, a chemist named Dr. Lucius Thorne, who occasionally supplied him with tonics, and an old naval comrade, Captain Elias Blackwood. They dined together and afterwards repaired to the drawing-room for cards, a habit of long standing among them. At about 11 o'clock, my father excused himself, saying he wished to fetch an old map from the attic to settle a dispute about trade routes. He was in excellent spirits. That was the last time I saw him alive. An hour passed, and when he did not return, I grew uneasy. I sent the butler upstairs, and he discovered my father lying lifeless beside an open trunk in the attic, amid the dust and cobwebs. The doctor who was summoned, Dr. Thorne himself, as it happened, pronounced it heart failure, and the coroner's inquest confirmed the finding. But I know in my heart it was no natural death. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair. "And the objects upon this table, madam, what is their connection?" For the first time her gaze fell fully upon the curious assortment, and a startled exclamation escaped her. "Those! They are my father's! Or rather, they were found among his private effects in the attic after his death. I locked them in a small dispatch box for safekeeping, intending to examine them later when I felt stronger. But yesterday the box disappeared from my dressing room. This morning I received a brief note, unsigned and printed in rough capitals. Seek Mr. Sherlock Holmes if you value justice. And now I find the very same articles here, in your possession. How is this possible?" Holmes lifted the brown wrapping paper that still lay beneath the objects. "Delivered anonymously to my door this evening. The sender clearly wished you to have my assistance without revealing himself, or herself. Tell me, Miss Hargrove, did your father have enemies?" She hesitated. "He was a hard man in business, Mr. Holmes. There were disputes over contracts, accusations of sharp practice. Mr. Slade has been pressing him for months about the division of profits. Captain Blackwood owed him large sums lost at cards. And Dr. Thorne, well, father had lately spoken of discontinuing his tonics, saying they did him no good." "And the attic," Holmes continued. "Was it a place your father frequented?" "Rarely. It is a vast, neglected space filled with trunks and crates from his voyages. He kept certain private papers there, he once told me, things he did not wish even the servants to stumble upon." Holmes rose and paced the room once or twice, his hands clasped behind him. "The hour grows late, Miss Hargrove, and you have endured much today. Return home and rest. Tomorrow morning Dr. Watson and I will call at Grosvenor Square and examine the attic for ourselves. In the meantime, say nothing of this visit to anyone, not even to the members of your household." She rose, her eyes filling with sudden hope. "You will take the case, then?" "I have already taken it," replied Holmes with a faint smile. "The game has begun." When she had gone, he stood for a long moment gazing down at the silent objects upon the table. "A dying message, Watson," he murmured at last. "Deliberately assembled and sent to us by someone who knew the victim well, perhaps by the victim himself in his final moments, though that seems scarcely possible. Yet the precision of the selection argues design rather than chance." I glanced at the clock. "It is past 10, Holmes. Will you not retire?" He shook his head. "Sleep is far from me tonight. I shall sit with our mute witnesses here until morning. There is much to be learned from them before we tread the scene itself. Good night, Watson." I left him there, the gas lamp burning steadily over the table, the fog pressing close against the windows, and the strange collection of objects, watch, vial, map, glove, envelope, cards, and photograph, lying in their enigmatic array, waiting for the keen intellect that alone could compel them to surrender the grim secret they concealed. The following morning broke dull and drizzly, with the fog lingering in the streets like a reluctant guest. Holmes was already astir when I descended, freshly shaved and alert, the objects from the parcel now arranged with methodical precision upon the table. The gas lamp had been extinguished, and the pale daylight filtering through the windows lent the articles a colder, more prosaic aspect. Yet they retained their air of silent urgency. Holmes greeted me with a nod. "I trust you slept well, Watson. Our little collection has been most instructive. Come, examine them with me before we depart for Grosvenor Square." He took up the tarnished silver pocket watch first, holding it to the light. "Note the time, 17 minutes past 3. The glass is uncracked, the stem intact. The hands were stopped deliberately. And observe the faint scratch upon the case as though it had been dashed against a hard surface in haste." Next he lifted the small vial, turning it so that the clear liquid caught the light. "Elixir vitae," he read aloud from the faded label. a pompous title for what may prove to be something far less benign. The cork is tight, the contents undisturbed. Yet there is a faint sediment at the bottom, suggestive of a compound that separates when left standing. He spread the crumpled map of London upon the table, smoothing it with his palm. An old ordnance survey sheet, much handled. The red circle around Whitechapel is drawn with fresh ink, carmine, not common vermilion. The warehouse district, I fancy. A place of import and export, where crates from distant ports are unloaded under cover of darkness. The single black glove he examined with particular care, drawing it over his own long fingers. Kid leather, gentleman's size, but stained at the tips with lampblack, such as a locksmith or a forger might use. The stitching is fine, the maker's mark that of a Bond Street glovemaker. Its fellow is absent, which is significant. He turned then to the yellowed envelope still sealed with its crimson wax impressed with the coiled serpent. The seal is fresh, the wax scarcely hardened. I shall not break it yet. Its contents may speak more eloquently when we know the full context. The scattered playing cards he gathered into a small pack, the ace of spades uppermost. A common enough deck, but note how the ace has been placed face up, as though to draw the eye. The corners of several cards are slightly bent, marks of frequent play, perhaps, or a signal known only to initiates. Finally, he took up the faded photograph, studying the stern, moustached gentleman whose image stared back with unsmiling severity. A cabinet portrait circa 1875 by a photographer in Bombay. The card is torn cleanly at the lower edge, as though ripped from a frame or an album in anger. The subject's features are strong, aquiline, military bearing, I should say, though the dress is civilian. I listened to these observations with growing interest, though their full import still eluded me. "You seem to find meaning in every detail, Holmes," said I. "To me, they remain a mere assemblage of curiosities." He smiled faintly. "That is because you see but do not observe, Watson. Consider, each object is worn, aged, save for the wax seal and the red ink upon the map. Each bears marks of use or violence, the broken chain, the stain, the tear. Taken together, they suggest a narrative of haste, of concealment, perhaps of a final desperate act." He replaced the photograph carefully. "The glove intrigues me most. A single glove is useless, unless it was lost unintentionally by one who had no time to retrieve it. And lamp-black upon a gentleman's glove argues clandestine work in darkness." At this point Mrs. Hudson entered with breakfast, and we fell silent until she had withdrawn. Holmes ate sparingly, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When we had finished, he rose and reached for his ulster. "Come, Watson, the hansom awaits. Miss Hargrove will be expecting us, and the attic in Grosvenor Square holds answers that these mute witnesses can only hint at." As we descended the stairs, he paused upon the landing, glancing back at the table where the objects lay in their silent array. "Mark them well, Watson," he said. "By tonight, if fortune favours us, we shall know why a dying man, or his faithful proxy, chose these particular things to send into the world as a cry for justice." The fog had thinned somewhat as we emerged into Baker Street, yet the air remained raw and chill. Our cab bowled swiftly westward, past the muffled figures of clerks and shop-girls hurrying to their daily tasks, while Holmes sat beside me in silence, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes half closed in that attitude of intense concentration I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. I glanced at him curiously. "You believe, then, that Sir Reginald was indeed murdered?" "I believe," he replied without opening his eyes, "that a man in fear of his life took extraordinary pains to leave behind a message that only the right mind could decipher." Whether he succeeded in that final effort remains to be seen, but I'm inclined to think he did. With that cryptic utterance he relapsed into silence, and I occupied myself with watching the familiar streets glide past until at length we drew up before a substantial residence in Grosvenor Square, its blinds half drawn in token of mourning, and its door opened by a grave-faced butler who ushered us within to where Miss Hargrove awaited us, pale but composed, ready to lead us upward to the forgotten attic where the tragedy had begun. The residence of the late Sir Reginald Hargrove in Grosvenor Square was a stately edifice of red brick, its windows shrouded by half-drawn blinds, and its doorstep adorned with a wreath of cypress in token of recent bereavement. The butler, who admitted us, wore the solemn aspect appropriate to the house, and Miss Hargrove herself met us in the hall, her face pale but resolute. "I am grateful you have come so promptly, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "The attic is just as it was left after the inquest. Nothing has been disturbed." Holmes inclined his head. "That is well. Lead on, if you please." She conducted us up the wide staircase, past landings hung with sombre portraits of former Hargroves, until we reached the topmost floor. A narrow door opened onto a steeper flight of uncarpeted stairs, and at their head a second door, locked, which Miss Hargrove opened with a key from her chatelaine. We emerged into a vast, dimly lit attic that stretched the full length of the house. Dust lay thick upon the floorboards, undisturbed save for a few footprints leading to an open trunk some 20 feet from the entrance. Slanting rays from a single dormer window, filmed with grime, illuminated cobwebs that festooned the rafters like grey veils, and the air was heavy with the musty odour of long neglect. "There," said Miss Hargrove in a low voice, pointing. "That is where they found him." Holmes stepped forward with that light cat-like tread which I had seen so often at the commencement of an investigation. He paused at the threshold, surveying the scene with keen, glancing eyes before advancing slowly toward the trunk. I followed, noting how his gaze swept the floor, the beams above, the stacked crates and leather-bound portmanteaus that lined the walls. The trunk in question was a large, iron-bound affair, its lid thrown back, revealing a jumble of yellowed charts, nautical instruments, and bundles of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. Beside it, upon the dusty boards, was a faint outline in chalk where the body had lain, a grim reminder supplied by the police surgeon. Holmes knelt, his magnifying lens in hand, and began a minute examination of the floor. "Observe, Watson," he said after a moment. "The dust here is thick, yet see how it has been disturbed in two distinct sets of footprints. One set, broad, heavy with the imprint of a military boot, leads directly from the stairs to the trunk. That would be Sir Reginald's. But there is a second, lighter set, narrower, overlapping the first in places and returning toward the stairs. Someone followed him up here, stood close behind him as he opened the trunk, and then retreated." Miss Hargrove, who had remained near the door, gave a little gasp. "Then it was murder." "Patience, madam," replied Holmes calmly. "We deal in facts, not surmises, yet the presence of a second person is indisputable." He rose and turned his attention to the trunk itself. With delicate fingers he explored its interior, lifting aside the charts until he exposed a false bottom, a panel cunningly fitted and secured by a small brass lock, now forced open. "Interesting," he murmured. "The lock shows fresh scratches, made by a tool rather than a key. Whatever was concealed here has been removed, and recently. Sir Reginald came up, I fancy, to consult or retrieve something from this compartment. His companion followed, perhaps unobserved at first." He straightened and cast his gaze about the attic. The window, sealed for years by the look of the cobwebs. No entrance there. The only access is the door by which we came. Therefore, the second person was either one of the guests below or an intruder who had concealed himself earlier. I ventured a question. But would not the servants have noticed a stranger? Possibly not, if he came before the household retired. Or, and this is more probable, he was one of the three gentlemen who dined that night. Miss Hargrove clasped her hands. All three are known to me. Mr. Slade has been my father's partner these 10 years. Dr. Thorne supplied medicines. Captain Blackwood was father's comrade from the Indian service. Holmes nodded. Then we must speak with each in turn. But first, one more detail. He dropped to his knees again, lens in hand, scrutinizing the floor near the chalk outline. After a moment, he gave a low exclamation of satisfaction, and with a pair of tweezers, lifted something almost invisible from the dust, a tiny scrap of white card, no larger than a thumbnail, bearing the black pip of a spade. This, he said, holding it to the light, did not come from the trunk. It was dropped, perhaps torn from a larger card in a moment of agitation. A clue, Watson, and a most suggestive one. He pocketed the fragment carefully, then rose and dusted his knees. I have seen enough for the present. The attic has yielded its first secrets. A second presence, a forced compartment, and this fragment of a playing card. The rest must come from the men who sat at table with Sir Reginald on his final evening. As we descended the stairs, Miss Hargrove whispered, "You will find the murderer, Mr. Holmes." "I shall find the truth," he replied gravely, "and truth in such matters seldom fails to bring the guilty to account." Outside the drizzle had ceased, though the sky remained leaden. Holmes paused upon the doorstep, drawing a deep breath of the cold air. "We shall begin with Captain Blackwood," he said decisively. "The spade is the suit of soldiers and of gamblers. A man who has lost heavily at cards may be driven to desperate measures. Come, Watson. The game deepens." Holmes lost no time in setting about the next phase of the inquiry. From Grosvenor Square we proceeded directly to the lodgings of Captain Elias Blackwood, a modest but respectable set of rooms in Half Moon Street. The captain, a bluff, weather-beaten man in his late 50s, with a reddish face and a heavy moustache that drooped at the corners, received us civilly enough, though I detected a wariness in his eye. "Sherlock Holmes? I have heard the name. And this is Dr. Watson, I presume? Come in, gentlemen, though I confess I am at a loss to know what brings you here." We seated ourselves in a small sitting room that bore evidence of naval service, charts upon the walls, a sextant upon the mantel, and a faded photograph of a younger Blackwood in uniform upon the sideboard. Holmes wasted no words upon preliminaries. "Captain Blackwood," he began, fixing the other with his steady gaze, "I am investigating the circumstances of Sir Reginald Hargrove's death. You were one of the last persons to see him alive." The captain's ruddy colour deepened. "I was indeed, sir. A sad business. Poor Reggie collapsed in the attic. Heart gave out, they said. Nothing any of us could do." "You played cards with him that evening?" "A rubber or two after dinner, yes. Nothing heavy." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Yet I am informed that Sir Reginald held notes of yours to a considerable amount, debts of honour incurred over several years." Blackwood shifted in his chair. "That is true. Reggie was generous enough to accommodate me when my pension proved insufficient for certain expenses, but he never pressed me for repayment. We were old comrades, you see, from the mutiny days." "And the ace of spades," said Holmes quietly, producing the small fragment he had found in the attic and laying it upon the table. "Does that convey any special meaning to you?" The captain glanced at it and gave a short laugh, though it rang hollow. "The death card, some fools call it. We used it now and then as a signal in our play, when a man was in deep and needed credit. Merely a private jest between Reggie and myself. Nothing more. Holmes's expression remained impassive. You left the house at what hour? Shortly after midnight. Slade and Thorne departed at the same time. We shared a cab as far as Piccadilly. Thank you, Captain. That will be all for the present. When we were once more in the street, I turned to Holmes. He has a motive, certainly. Heavy debt. And that fragment of the spade was found beside the body. Undoubtedly, replied Holmes. Yet observe that he did not deny the signal, nor show surprise at the fragment. A guilty man might have done either. No, Watson, the captain is in the web, but I doubt if he is the spider. Our next call was upon Dr. Lucius Thorne, whose consulting rooms and laboratory occupied a narrow house in Harley Street. He was a thin, ascetic-looking man of 40 or thereabouts, with pale eyes that seemed to peer through one rather than at one. He received us with professional courtesy, but his fingers toyed incessantly with a glass pipette upon his desk. Sir Reginald was my patient for some years, he admitted in response to Holmes's questions. He suffered from dyspepsia, and I compounded certain tonics for him, vegetable extracts, nothing more. Including, said Holmes, producing the small vial from his pocket and placing it before the chemist, this preparation labelled elixir vitae? Dr. Thorne adjusted his spectacles and examined the vial closely. Yes, that is one of my bottles. A harmless restorative, extract of gentian, with a little alcohol. Sir Reginald was fond of the name. He insisted upon the Latin label. You were present when he was found dead? I was summoned immediately. I pronounced cardiac failure. There were all the classic signs. No trace of poison, Mr. Holmes. I should have detected it. Holmes thanked him gravely, and we departed. In the cab, he remarked, a competent man, and his answers were direct. Yet chemists, Watson, are adept at concealing traces. We shall keep Dr. Thorne in mind. Last of the trio was Mr. Victor Slade, the business partner whom we found at the offices of Hargrove and Slade in Mincing Lane. He was a stout, florid man of 50, impeccably dressed with small, shrewd eyes that flickered rapidly as he spoke. Reggie's death was a shock, gentlemen. A great shock. We had built the firm together these 20 years. As for enemies, he had rivals, of course, but no man who wished him dead that I ever heard. Holmes questioned him closely about the firm's affairs. Slade admitted that certain recent ventures had not prospered, and that Sir Reginald had lately spoken of reviewing the partnership accounts. He wished to bring in an independent auditor, Slade said with a tight smile. A needless expense, in my view, but Reggie could be obstinate. And you were in the house on the night he died? Briefly, after cards. I left with the others. Holmes produced the photograph from the parcel, the stern gentleman with the moustache, and laid it before him. Do you recognize this portrait? Slade glanced at it and shrugged. Looks like Reggie himself in his younger days. Bombay, perhaps. Why? Holmes did not answer, but pocketed the photograph again. As we left the office, he murmured, Slade lies, Watson. The photograph is not of Sir Reginald. The features are heavier, the nose more aquiline. And note how his eyes avoided it. There is an old betrayal here, I fancy. Night was falling as our cab carried us back toward Baker Street. I confess I was puzzled. 3 motives, Holmes: debt, professional disagreement, financial embarrassment, yet no clear indication which man followed Sir Reginald to the attic. Patience, Watson, he replied, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. We have yet to visit the place marked upon the map, the warehouse in Whitechapel. There, under cover of darkness, we may find the thread that binds these seeming disparate clues into a single rope. He leaned back, his chin upon his breast, and I knew better than to interrupt the train of thought that was rapidly drawing the scattered elements of the case toward their hidden center. The fog had returned with renewed density as evening deepened into night, wrapping London in a damp, impenetrable shroud that turned the gas lamps into mere halos of yellow light. Holmes and I, well muffled in ulsters and scarves, alighted from our hansom in the narrow confines of Ratcliffe Highway, deep in the warehouse district of Whitechapel. The map from the parcel, with its crimson circle, had led us unerringly to this desolate spot. A rambling brick structure beside the river, its windows dark and its doors barred. Holmes consulted the map once more beneath the feeble glow of a street lamp. Number 17, Thames Wharf. The firm of Hargrove and Slade has used it for years, according to the directories. Tonight it shall yield up its secrets. We approached cautiously, for the neighborhood was ill-famed and the hour late. The main door was secured by a heavy padlock, but Holmes, producing a small ring of keys from his pocket, worked silently until a faint click announced success. We slipped inside, closing the door softly behind us. The interior was a vast cavern of shadows, redolent of spices, hemp, and the faint tang of the river. Crates and bales rose in towering stacks, their markings, Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, visible in the thin beam of Holmes's bullseye lantern. He moved forward with that silent purpose I knew so well, sweeping the light across the floor until it revealed a narrow aisle leading deeper into the building. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "Fresh footprints in the dust. 2 sets, one heavier than the other. Someone has been here very recently." We followed the trail until it ended at a row of smaller crates, newly pried open. Holmes knelt, examining the contents with care. "Ledgers," he murmured, lifting out a stout volume bound in black leather. "And correspondence. Bills of lading, invoices, all bearing the stamp of Hargrove and Slade." He turned the pages rapidly, his face intent in the lantern's glow. "Here we have it, Watson, evidence of systematic smuggling. Duty evaded upon silks and spices, false declarations, bribes to customs officials. Sir Reginald's signature appears upon many, but latterly there are discrepancies. Amounts altered, entries in a different hand. Mr. Victor Slade has been helping himself liberally to the profits." A faint sound echoed through the warehouse, a scrape of boot upon plank. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly, and we stood in darkness, listening. Footsteps approached, hurried and uneven, accompanied by the low mutter of a man's voice speaking to himself. A match flared, revealing the stout figure of Victor Slade, his face glistening with sweat despite the chill. He carried a dark lantern and a small crowbar, and made straight for the crates we had just examined. Kneeling, he began to pry at another, clearly intent upon removing or destroying the incriminating volumes. Holmes stepped forward, relighting his own lantern so that the beam fell full upon the intruder. "Good evening, Mr. Slade. You are somewhat late for honest business." Slade started violently, dropping the crowbar with a clatter. For a moment he seemed poised for flight, but the sight of Holmes's revolver quietly produced checked him. "You meddling devil," he snarled. "How did you know?" "The map so thoughtfully provided," replied Holmes coolly, "and the serpent seal upon the envelope, your personal emblem, I believe, from your club notepaper. But pray compose yourself. We have much to discuss." Slade's bravado collapsed. He sank upon a crate, his face ashen. "It was not meant to end in murder," he muttered. "Reginald discovered the discrepancies only last week. He threatened exposure. Ruin for us both, but chiefly for me, since I had falsified the books. That night after cards, I followed him to the attic. He opened the secret compartment to retrieve the duplicate ledgers he kept there. I begged him to reconsider, but he was adamant." "And then?" prompted Holmes. Slade passed a trembling hand across his brow. "I carried a vial of Thorne's elixir. Reginald had given me one for my own use, but Thorne had lately confided that in stronger concentration it could stop the heart. In desperation, I poured a few drops into Reginald's glass during dinner. When he went upstairs, I followed to plead once more. He grew faint, collapsed. In panic, I forced the compartment, took the ledgers and fled, losing my glove in the dark. Holmes nodded. The watch you stopped at the time of death, 3:17, to support your alibi of having left earlier. The ace of spades was a blind to direct suspicion toward Captain Blackwood and his gambling debts. Slade made a sudden lunge toward the door, but Holmes was swifter. A brief struggle ensued, in which I assisted, and soon the man lay bound with rope from a nearby bale. "We shall summon the police from the nearest station," said Holmes calmly. "But first, Watson, note how the pieces fit. The torn photograph, that was of Slade himself in younger days, ripped from Reginald's album when old betrayals resurfaced. All was designed to appear natural death, but conscience, or fear, prompted someone to assemble those clues and send them forth." "Someone?" I echoed. "You mean not Sir Reginald himself?" Holmes shook his head, impossible in his final moments. No, this was the work of one who discovered the truth later and dared not speak openly. Miss Hargrove herself, I suspect, though she shall never admit it. We led the captive Slade into the night, where the fog swirled thicker than ever, and the distant hoot of a river tug sounded mournfully across the water. As our cab conveyed us back toward Baker Street, with Slade guarded between us, and a constable summoned by whistle, Holmes gazed out into the murk. "A sordid tale, Watson. Greed, betrayal, and a moment's madness. Yet it began with that curious parcel upon our table, a silent cry from the grave that only observation could answer." Dawn was breaking grey and cold as we reached our lodgings, the prisoner handed over to the official force. Holmes sank into his chair, weariness at last overtaking him. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall return the objects to Miss Hargrove, their purpose fulfilled. The enigma is resolved, and justice, though tardy, has prevailed." The pale light of a December morning was struggling through the fog when Sherlock Holmes and I, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade and 2 constables, returned to our sitting room at Baker Street. Victor Slade, pale and sullen, sat handcuffed in a cab below, awaiting conveyance to Scotland Yard. Miss Eleanor Hargrove had been summoned by an early note from Holmes, and she now entered the room, her mourning veil thrown back, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Lestrade, small, dark, and ferret-like as ever, rubbed his hands together with professional satisfaction. "A neat capture, Mr. Holmes. The man was caught almost red-handed with the ledgers. But I confess I should like to hear how you unravelled it all from that queer parcel of rubbish." Holmes waved a weary hand toward the table, where the objects lay once more in their original array, exactly as they had appeared in the anonymous parcel. The tarnished pocket watch stopped at 3:17, the vial of elixir vitae, the crumpled map with its red circle around Whitechapel, the single-stained black glove, the yellowed envelope with its serpent seal, the scattered playing cards dominated by the ace of spades, and the torn photograph of the stern gentleman. Rubbish, Lestrade? Far from it. These are the dying message of Sir Reginald Hargrove himself, or as near to it as a man in his final moments could contrive. Miss Hargrove gave a low exclamation. "My father, himself." Holmes nodded gravely. "Consider the circumstances. Sir Reginald, feeling the first effects of the poison administered in his after-dinner brandy, excuses himself and climbs to the attic, perhaps suspecting already the hand that struck him. He knows his time is short. He opens the secret compartment in the trunk to secure the duplicate ledgers that would expose Slade's fraud, but weakness overtakes him. Yet even as he collapses, his mind, disciplined by years of commerce and command, works with desperate clarity. He realizes that Slade will search the attic, remove the ledgers, and stage a natural death. Conventional outcry is impossible. The servants are below, the guests departing. But he has about him, or within quick reach in the open trunk, certain articles that can tell the tale to the right observer. First, his own pocket watch. He stops it deliberately at the exact moment of collapse, 3:17, knowing that Slade's alibi depends upon claiming an earlier departure. The broken chain symbolizes the abrupt severance of life. The vial of elixir vitae, thorns restorative, but now the instrument of death. He places prominently a silent accusation against the poisoner who used it. The map, already marked with the location of the warehouse where the original falsified ledgers are stored, he leaves unfolded, the red circle glaring like a drop of blood. His glove. Slade, in nervous haste, had dropped one while tampering with the compartment earlier that evening. Sir Reginald finds it and adds it to the collection, the lamp-black stains betraying nocturnal work. The envelope, sealed with Slade's own distinctive serpent device, taken perhaps from correspondence in the trunk, stands as the partner's personal signature upon the crime. The playing cards, with the ace of spades uppermost, are a deliberate misdirection toward Captain Blackwood and his gambling debts, to ensure that suspicion is divided and the inquiry deepened. Finally, the torn photograph of Slade himself in younger days, ripped from an album during a recent quarrel over the accounts, completes the indictment, an old comrade turned betrayer. Lestrade whistled softly. And the dying man arranged all this with his last strength? Precisely. He gathered the articles upon a sheet of brown paper from the trunk, wrapped them hastily and, knowing his daughter would eventually discover the disturbed attic, left them where she could not fail to find them. But death came quicker than he anticipated. He could not add a written note. The parcel was later found by Miss Hargrove, who, suspecting murder but fearing to accuse Slade openly, sent it anonymously to me with the brief instruction to seek justice. Miss Hargrove's eyes filled with tears. I dared not speak his name. Mr. Slade has powerful friends, and I had no proof, only suspicion. But when I found those objects arranged so strangely, I felt my father himself was guiding me. Holmes inclined his head. You acted wisely and courageously, madam. The message reached the one mind capable of reading it. Lestrade rose, pulling on his gloves. Well, Mr. Holmes, it's a pretty piece of deduction and no mistake. The Yard will take it from here. Slade will hang, I fancy. When the official and his prisoner had departed, Miss Hargrove lingered a moment. I can never repay you, Mr. Holmes. Repayment lies in the knowledge that justice is done, he replied gently. Your father's ingenuity deserved no less. She took her leave, and the room fell silent save for the crackle of the fire. I regarded the objects upon the table with new wonder. A remarkable testament, Holmes, a man speaking clearly from beyond the grave. He leaned back, filling his pipe with shag. Observation and logic, Watson. Those were Sir Reginald's weapons in life, and he wielded them to the end. Had he been less methodical, Slade might have escaped. As it was, these humble things, watch, vial, map, glove, envelope, cards, and photograph, became the instruments of his triumph over death itself. Outside, the fog began at last to lift, and faint shafts of winter sunlight touched the windows of 221B. Within, the enigmatic assemblage lay quiet at last, its grim purpose fulfilled, its secrets fully told. Thus ended the adventure of the Enigma of the Forgotten Attic, a case which more than many reminded me how fragile is the veil between life and death, and how powerfully the human mind, even in its final flicker, may reach across that darkness to summon light and justice.